Welcome everybody to this video where I'm going to give you a brief overview of the so-called replication crisis in psychology and biomedical sciences and talk a little bit about how the world of research is changing as a function of this crisis. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is jump in my time machine and we're going to travel back to 2011. So in 2011, you may have read about this at the time, it might have been mentioned in some undergraduate textbooks, but in 2011, Darrell Bem apparently proved the existence of extrasensory perception. In other words, the ability to see into the future. Obviously, this caused quite a lot of discussion on the media and various blogs and whatnot. Certainly it was all over social media at the time. And just to spend a minute or so talking about this paper. So Darrell Bem is a very well-respected senior academic. He published a paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which appeared to show that the future can influence the present. And in a fairly standard priming paradigm, Darrell Bem showed that participants responded faster to target words that were then followed by the prime word than if they hadn't been followed by that prime word. So in other words, this kind of, obviously a bit counterintuitive. Your response time to a particular word is influenced by the word that comes next that you haven't seen at that point. So Darrell Bem's very distinguished track record. JPSP is a great journal, so the paper came out in this fantastic journal. And it went through the absolutely standard, rigorous peer review process where other academics look at the research, they might ask for clarifications or corrections or modifications of some sort. And the paper also used absolutely standard experimental methods and absolutely standard statistical techniques to analyse the data. And yet it appeared to be the case that ESP is real. By the way, it's not, obviously. This is the problem. So a few years after this paper came out, there's a great article in Slate, and I think this sums up the situation so clearly. Darrell Bem proved that ESP is real, which means that science is broken. So there's something fundamentally wrong with the scientific process if it's led to researchers, concluding that such things as extrasensory perception actually exist. So what happened? Okay, so Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson kind of dug into this paper and also a lot of other papers at the time that seemed to be sort of maybe producing effects that seemed a little bit implausible, to put it politely. So Simmons and colleagues showed that when researchers don't report all their data, so when they selectively drop certain participants that maybe don't produce data patterns in line with other participants, when researchers drop problematic trials, such as outliers, when they do a whole bunch of different statistical analyses, but report only those analyses where the p-value is below the magical alpha level of 0.05, for example. If they do all of these things, this results in what's known as an inflated false set of false positives. In other words, thinking you found effects when those effects really aren't real. All of these practices together are collectively termed p-hacking. So in terms of how psychology as a discipline began to address these issues, Bran Nosek set up the Centre for Open Science in 2013 and also spearheaded a whole bunch of replication studies going out there to the psychological literature, looking for papers in great journals, long-standing effects, and with a team of global researchers, he began to investigate just how much of the psychological literature is actually not replicable. In other words, is probably just wrong. So you may recognise these three characters. What's unusual about them is, well, there are many things unusual about them, but the main thing that's unusual about them with respect to this slide is the way in which they're standing. So they're adopting what's known as a power pose. And if you're of a certain generation, or if you have a thing about 1980s classic British comedy, you might recognise this kind of stance from Blackadder 3, this power pose, the stance that people adopt to give them power and authority. And it all came from this paper published by Dana Carney, Amy Cuddy and Andy Yap in 2010, which seemed to suggest that power posing actually doesn't just make you feel more powerful, it actually results in you becoming more powerful via, increases in sort of testosterone levels, decreases in cortisol, etc. And this is, obviously very dramatic. If just by changing the way in which you're standing, you can actually become more powerful, more confident as an individual. Not surprisingly, this paper was picked up widely by the media. Many consultancy organisations were then asked by business leaders, by politicians, to come in and at vast expense teach those business leaders and politicians effectively how to stand. So this is why those three Tory politicians are standing as they are. They obviously had some consultant come in and talk to them about power posing. So in 2010, it was a big thing. It was all over the newspapers, all over the web. If you act powerfully, you will begin to think powerfully. You kind of guess where this is going, by the way, I'm sure. It's not true. It didn't replicate. This study is just nonsense. And even one of the co-authors in 2016 came out and said, yep, I now think it's all nonsense. I do not believe that power pose effects are real. Standing like John Wayne in a gunfight does not make you feel like a successful gunslinger. It just makes you look silly. So there were a whole bunch of studies that were examined by the Brand Nosek team to determine whether or not they could be replicated. And if they could be replicated, were the magnitudes of the effects similar to those which were reported originally. So 270 authors on the team tried to replicate 100 experiments drawn from some of the top psychology journals. Psychological Science, which is where the power posing paper came out, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is where the BEM paper came out, and then the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory and Cognition. And if we look at this wee graphic over here on the left, we see out of those 100 experiments, 61 didn't replicate. Okay? And even of the ones that did replicate, in many cases, the effect sizes were actually smaller in the replication than they were in the original. So psychology clearly has a problem with replicability of research findings. Some of the very high-profile effects that didn't replicate include these ones here. So we talked about power posing, but there are also phenomena such as ego depletion and social priming, things that you might have come across previously. Learning styles, these things either didn't replicate or produce much smaller effect sizes than were originally reported. Turns out that the classic Stanford prison experiment really wasn't an experiment. There are a huge number of issues with that. Growth mindset, etc. All of these things either don't exist or are actually much smaller in terms of the effect than people previously thought. And there are lots more examples. I mean, there really are examples everywhere. And it turns out that we've known about these sorts of problems with respect to research practices for a while. Going all the way back to 1967, Paul Meehl talks about the use of ad hoc explanations for experimental results. The idea that you'll generate a set of hypotheses, run an experiment or a set of experiments to test those hypotheses. Maybe the hypotheses aren't supported, but you look at your data, you see patterns in your data, and people are great at seeing patterns and random noise. I mean, just think of those, all those different shapes of animals and things that you can see when you look at the clouds. So people are great at spotting apparent patterns and what is essentially noise. And this is kind of the problem that Paul Meehl was starting to get at as well. Coming up with these sort of cute or clever experimental designs, then engaging in a little bit of navel gazing once you have your data in, allows you to tell some really interesting, really compelling story based on your data. That's probably just nonsense. 1994, Doug Altman really highlighted the issue with the academic incentive structure, where researchers are effectively rewarded for doing lots of research. They're not actually rewarded for doing good research. It's more a focus on quantity over quality. So abandoning measures that try to capture research performance, such as the number of publications generated, would be a good way to start fixing the system. Herbert Care, a few years later, came up with this wonderful concept called harking, which really captures a number of the issues. So this is the idea: you're hypothesizing after the results are known. You come up with an experiment, you look at the data, you look at what's significant, you scratch your head, have a bit of a think, and then determine the likely story, where you're really coming up with this explanation after you've looked at your data. That's really just a way of almost trying to come up with a story that fits the data. It was never something that you hypothesized or set out to investigate. In 2005, one of the arguably most influential papers on this general topic of reproducibility and replication was published by John Ioannidis, who quite controversially said that he thought most published research findings were false. This is obviously a very broad, sweeping statement, and it caused lots of different disciplines to actually start to look at their own set of research outputs to try and figure out, was this a problem for them as much as it seemed to be for other disciplines? And the short answer is that yes, this is a problem everywhere. This is a problem across science very broadly. A lot of what's published is just wrong. So what happened? I mean, how did this come about? Is it not the case that there are just good scientists out there and bad scientists? Well, it's more the case that good scientists, unintentionally, without malice, have been engaging in questionable research practices that result in these false positive papers being published. And they've adopted these questionable research practices partly as a function of the incentive structure in academia that up until recently didn't really incentivize good scientific practice. I'm happy to say things are changing now, and I'll come on to some of those changes a little bit later. Well, this was the world that academics were working in at the time, where it was really, the focus was on newsworthy findings coming out in top journals, lots of them, and whether they were right or wrong, it almost didn't matter. You got promoted on the basis of lots of papers and lots of top journals. There wasn't any recognition that something like research reproducibility or research robustness was actually something that was important. This great graphic, developed by Marcus Manafu, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, and colleagues, captures all of the different stages in the research life cycle where p-hacking, lack of power, harking, etc., all come in and result in, these sort of questionable research practices result in a scientific literature that contains lots of results that simply aren't true. I'll talk about some of these issues in a second. P-hacking we've already covered. Publication bias is a big issue. It's easy to get, relatively easy to get journal articles published where you report significant results. It's very difficult to report null results and have those published. So if you fail to replicate some long-standing effect, you're not going to get your article published probably, and other people then aren't going to hear about all the negative evidence against a particular effect. They're only going to see the original paper. So as I said, experimental power is a little bit of an issue. There are too many studies that are conducted with a number of observations and a level of experimental power that's simply not sufficient to detect the effect size of interest. Even when effects are found, one of the consequences of low-powered study, in other words, not having enough data points in your data set, is that even when you do find a real effect, because of the low-powered nature of your design, you're probably going to overestimate the magnitude of the effect size. And this is really problematic, because if your overestimation of the effect size is published, then people are going to base their work in terms of their experimental power for their studies is going to be based on the published effect size, which is probably, well, which will be misleading, and they'll then fail to find the effect because they've effectively run an underpowered experiment. And as I mentioned, you've got a publication bias in literature, where it's easy to get papers published where they report significant results. It's much harder to publish null results, and this is an issue that is being addressed actually by the registered report mode of publication, which we'll talk about in a later video. So how big a problem is experimental power? Well, it's a pretty big problem, according to great work by Kate Button and colleagues and Nord and colleagues, which shows that across neuroscience, biomedical sciences, many disciplines have low-powered experiments. So in work in genetics, the median power of an experiment is only about 11%. And what this means, essentially, is that even if there is a real effect to be found, only 11% of the time are you going to find it. So what a complete waste of time, money, resources that is. So even though the effect is there, you can't find it because your experiment doesn't have sufficient power. Psychology is about 50%, which is obviously better than some of those lower ones, but it's still not great. So half of the time, even though the effect is there to be found, you're simply not going to find it because your experiment doesn't have sufficient power. This is a great letter by Dorothy Bishop, which I recommend that you read. It's linked in the workshop material. Dorothy Bishop is phenomenal academic, hugely well known for her work on child development, child language, and relatively recently then became a massive influence in the world of open research, reproducibility, and replicability. I say, have a wee read of this letter. I think it's summarised nicely by this sentence here. Many researchers persist in working in a way almost guaranteed not to deliver meaningful results. The great thing, though, is that Dorothy is very optimistic, and as a result of a lot of the sort of increased awareness of these issues, things are actually changing. So things are getting better. One of the organisations that's really at the centre for this improvement in research is the UK Reproducibility Network, or the UKRN. This network was founded by Marcus Manafu, who I mentioned previously, at the University of Bristol. And it really brings together a whole bunch of academics at every level, from early career researchers all the way up to senior professors, who are all concerned and have been concerned for a while about the lack of research reproducibility, replicability, openness and transparency in research. So this network came together as a way to kind of mobilise all these individuals who were concerned about the ways in which research was being conducted, working with sort of policyholders, stakeholders, different universities. And the focus is very much on really investigating the factors that contribute to robust research, including incentivisation structures. We need to provide training to researchers so they actually know why these questionable research practices are problematic, and they know how to do research better. So there's a lot of work that the UK Reproducibility Network is doing to actually improve the robustness, the transparency, etc. of UK research. And this has been recognised now at a much higher level within the UK. Research England has just given, in 2021 has given the UK Reproducibility Network £4.5 million to fund or part fund an £8.5 million programme of work running over 5 years, focused on growing and embedding open research into institutional practice and culture within the UK. And it's great that Manchester is one of the 18 institutional members of the UK Reproducibility Network who are involved in this programme of activity. I'm the institutional lead at the University of Manchester for Open and Reproducible Research, and I sit on the UK Reproducibility Network group of institutional leads and act as one of the co-leads for this big Research England project. Round about the same time, the government decided to launch a Parliamentary Inquiry run through the Science and Technology Committee, trying to understand what the issues are around lack of reproducibility, replicability and openness in research, and how we can improve research integrity amongst researchers by addressing some of the fundamental issues and changing the way in which academics are incentivised, changing the way in which their research is recognised as a way to improve the research that's generated by UK research groups. So Marcus and Dorothy both gave evidence at this inquiry, so they were actually called to Parliament to present their views to the inquiry, and the UKRN also submitted some written evidence. This paper here is one that I led on, where we highlight the issues that we see in UK research culture that need to be addressed, and we suggest ways in which they could be addressed that will together improve research replicability and robustness. And really it's centred around openness, transparency, incentivisation and training. So the academic incentive structure clearly has to change. People need to be rewarded for doing high quality research rather than just expensive research or lots of research. And even across disciplines and institutions, it's interesting, a lot of people still don't understand what research openness and research transparency actually mean. So there's a lot of conversations to be had with different disciplines about what open research, what transparent research practices might look like for each of those different disciplines, because it will look different in psychology versus medicine versus sociology, versus history. Lots of different quantitative and qualitative techniques are used in these different disciplines, and by necessity, transparency in the research process is going to look different depending on what methods of research different disciplines adopt. Massive challenge here, and I'm really pleased that you're all doing this MRes, because this challenge is focused on education and training. We need to be teaching open and transparent research practices to our students. In other words, you, the next generation of researchers. So you need to know how to do things differently, how to do things better so that you don't repeat the mistakes of the past. This is one of the reasons why in this unit you're going to be learning a lot about open, transparent, reproducible research workflows using data science languages such as R. So languages that are transparent, that you can share your analysis code and data with your colleagues, with your collaborators. You can have your analysis code and data published alongside your journal articles. And there's actually a huge computational skills gap amongst everybody, PhD students as well, postdocs, and also some very senior academics just don't have the skills that they need in order to do research in a fully open and transparent manner. And the problem is, if you don't have these skills, if you don't know how to share your data in a manner that's usable to others, if you don't know how to write analysis code and share your statistical analysis code with others, if you can't do these things, you're simply not able to engage in open and reproducible research practices.